Well, good morning. Hi there. Let's give this thing a minute to get going. Let's make sure everything is working the way it's supposed to, and I think we're set up there. So it looks like the streams are going. And welcome to the Footlight Broadcast. My name is Brian O'Kelly. I will be your host for today's adventure, broadcasting from Cottage Lake, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And I think that I hope that you'll find what I have to share today valuable. The topic today is science and the Bible. Can the Bible be trusted? Is science something that has now rendered the Bible obsolete? Are there things that science have demonstrated that just make the Bible a myth that we should discard? And should Christians on the opposite side discard science? And the answer to this is, of course, no, in both cases, in my view. I believe that we should, in fact, embrace scientific discovery. We should embrace the things that scientists have to offer. And good morning, Ken. Nice to see you again. And thank you for being a faithful viewer of the show. So I do believe we should embrace the things that science has to offer. I don't think we should ignore them. I do think that we should understand what they mean and what they don't mean. But on the other side, we should embrace what the Bible has to say about things. And where we have apparent points of conflict, we have a responsibility, I believe, to attempt to do our best to harmonize those things together in a way that is sensible. Good morning, Daryl. Nice to see you. Welcome. So that's the purpose of the show today, and it's not to. I have no interest at any level in denigrating science or putting science down. I do have an interest in understanding its limitations, and the same in the case of the Bible. I don't have any interest in denigrating the Bible or putting the Bible down, but I have an interest in understanding its limitations. And so that's the purpose for what we're going to do today. By the way, just looking at something on the screen here, and some of you guys who are in the chat can let me know. There may be an odd echo in my voice. If there is, let me know that. I don't think so, but there may be, just looking at one of the meters here on the screen. So let me know if that's the case. I think it's probably fine, but let me know if it's not also. That's helpful. Here we go. Let's jump right into this. So the first thing I promised in the pre-show promotion, if you will, is that I was going to discuss scientism and what is scientism. And some of the commenters said that the fact that I even used the word, because it's a quote-unquote creationist word, is evidence of my bias. Well, cool. No echo. That's great news. I just wasn't sure if it was there because I have this like 2-meter thing, and one was showing me that there might be. Good news. So what is scientism? And where does it go from? Hey, Frank, nice to see you. Lots of old friends joining this morning. That's awesome. So scientism has a definition, and the definition I'm adopting here isn't my definition. I didn't make this up. I'm going to grab it from Wikipedia. So here is what Wikipedia defines as scientism. So from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, you can look this up yourself. Scientism is the view that science and the scientific method are the best or the only objective means by which people should determine normative and epistemological values. Now, epistemology is a fancy word for the grounds of knowledge. Episode number 1 of this broadcast was entitled The Grounds of Knowledge, and it was about this very topic, epistemology. And epistemology, again, is a fancy word for saying, how do we know what we know? We know things, but how do we know them? For example, if you are not a chemist and you understand that water is constructed of H2O, how do you know that? You are taking literally the word of chemists and scientists for it if you haven't yourself gone into the research of understanding how, not only how, but visually inspecting and with the instruments and techniques they use, which I'm not familiar with, how they determine that water is constructed of the 2 hydrogen molecules and the 1 oxygen molecule. So that's what epistemology means, is how do we know what we know? So continue on the definition from Wikipedia: the improper usage of science or scientific claims This usually applies equally in contexts where science might not apply, such as when the topic is perceived as beyond the scope of scientific inquiry, and in contexts where there is insufficient empirical evidence to justify a scientific conclusion. And that's what one of the definitions of scientism. The second one they offer is the belief that the methods of natural science, or the categories and things recognized in natural science, form the only proper elements in any philosophical or other inquiry, or that science, and only science, describes the world as it is in itself, independent of perspective, with a concomitant elimination of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of experience. And so that's what scientism is. In other words, the idea here is of scientism is that science, one of my old friends used to say often, he said, science is the only way to prove anything. And I usually would respond, and of course he stopped saying it, I'd respond, well, can you tell me about the science experiment that was done to prove that science is the only way to prove anything? Because you're making a truth claim here that science is the only way to prove anything, so there must have been a science experiment to prove your truth claim, and of course there wasn't. So we are going to talk about the scientific method shortly, but first I want to talk with you about the impact of scientism on Christianity and on other faiths at the same time. So we know that, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of cool, refreshing water here because I'm getting the dry mouth thing that starts at the start of the show because I'm always a little nervous on these things. I don't know why I'm nervous. I've done enough of this, but I still am. Maybe because the topic's so important today, and to me, I hope to you. So Christian practice is diminishing in the West, and largely it's because of the impact of scientism. There's an apparent conflict between the two disciplines, or a perceived conflict, or more accurately, an attempt on the part of the scientists or scientism adherents to create a conflict and try and demonstrate the Bible is irrelevant. And of course, they're, in my view, failing at that in terms of really being accurate, but they're succeeding in terms of gaining at some level some influence in the society, and that's unfortunate. We're to the point now where writers like Richard Dawkins are claiming that science can and should in fact replace religion, that he sees religion as superstitious and science as founded in objective reality. So the arguments are basically two things. They do see religion as irrational, and they see the achievements of science as practical. And this is really based on an errant understanding of what the Bible does and doesn't say, and the styles of literature in the Bible. And I'm not going to go into that deeply. The last episode was all about that as a setup for this. And if some of the things I'm going to share today don't make sense perfectly, it's a good idea maybe to go back and check out the last episode. So public discourse, our public conversation, is increasingly influenced by scientism, as though it were rational and objective, and opposed to religion as irrational and subjective. And I would say this, that science itself is rational and objective, but scientism isn't, because scientism concludes that the only way to know anything is through science. We're going to talk in a little while, after we talk about the scientific method, of the things that can't be subjected to the scientific method. So we know that religious intolerance operates both within religious groups. There are Christians who are intolerant of each other's views of Christianity. And then religious intolerance operates, of course, between religious groups: Christians, Muslims, Jews, the Taliban brand of Islam, destroying the Buddha statues. There's, religious intolerance that happens within groups and between groups. And these religious dogmas are often used as weapons to attack and marginalize people considered to be nonconformist. And this process that happens between people infighting within religions and fighting amongst religions is one of the reasons why scientism is gaining some idea of rationality, and religions are gaining an idea of irrationality in the modern parlance. So The scientism mindset defines the gospel stories and all other religions as forms of mythology. And the result of that is that theological disagreements that cause either church schisms or conflicts between a theistic worldview or different religions are reduced in the mind of the scientism adherent to being entirely meaningless. After all, it's all myth. Who cares which myth they're fighting about? So we have this field of evolutionary biology, which, by the way, is not a scientific discipline. We'll get into that in a minute. And evolutionary biologists have explained that religion and politics did, and this is true, evolve in tandem with one another, often to support male patriarchal power structures. And religion has, in fact, been used as a force for social control in a lot of ways and a lot of places. And obviously, that's an abuse of religion. And in the case of Christianity, it's definitely an abuse of the ideas of Jesus. What that doesn't mean is that the Bible text supports those activities. The fact that people have abused the Bible in that way, or even other religions in that way, doesn't mean that that's what those religions teach or what their founders taught. And so I think it's important to make a distinction. We're going to get into the scientific method here in a minute, but hang on. I think it's important to make a distinction between religion as a phenomenon and the defining characteristics of individual religions as they're practiced today, as opposed to how those religions were while they were under the immediate influence of their founders. And so Christianity, which I'm a Christian proudly, was unique, well led by Jesus. And Jesus was a man who taught, and of course, when I say a man, don't think I'm limiting him to mankind. But don't call me out. You said Jesus was a man. It's amazing how often I've heard that after I started these things. But Jesus taught justice for all. He really did. And regarding the relationship between religion and violence, Jesus, who had the potential to be a political Messiah, the Jews were looking for a military leader to lead them out of Roman captivity, and Jesus refused to do so. So the people who say that Christianity is a violent religion, well, some Christians have been violent, and some Christians have been violent in the name of Christianity, but that was never something that Jesus would have endorsed. If you remember, Peter cut off the ear of Malchus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus said, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword," eschewing violence. Jesus was not interested in violence, in fact, condemned it. Religious dogmas and norms that are used sometimes as weapons to attack the marginalized or those considered to be other within religious communities. The minister of Jesus was notable because he challenged religious practice. The entire story of the Good Samaritan is based on the idea that the Samaritans were bitter enemies of the Jews. And Jesus was saying, listen, if a good man is a good man and he's not part of your group, he's a better man than a man who's part of your group who doesn't do the right thing. Jesus was into diversity, if you will, but not for diversity's sake. But he was saying that there's no difference between one group and another. What differentiates people is their behavior. Jesus was a promoter of women. Jesus, put women in a position that men never, religious people, especially the religious people of the day, never put them in. It's not a small thing that the first people to see Jesus after the resurrection were women. I don't think that's just a coincidence. Obviously, God is kind of in charge of that. He could have had Jesus resurrect instead an hour earlier or later when there were men there. So, this idea that Jesus was something other than into the equality for all is just it's not true. The fact that some Christians haven't been really has nothing to do with Jesus or nothing, I guess I was going to say, or little. Jesus himself refused to conform with the petty and burdensome rules of the religious establishment of the day. He took some huge social risks, if you will, in championing women, championing those considered sinners, Zacchaeus, if you remember, and other outsiders. And for Jesus, the worst kind of religious leaders were those who prioritized legalism over love. The authoritarian control tendencies of religious people were there all along in the old Jewish system. And of course, they began to emerge in the Christian system, especially when Christianity became the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The idea of one church that was a hallmark of the first century church, the Jesus church, if you will, is an idea that doesn't other anyone. And it's a picture of diverse populations from multiple places, multiple languages, multiple peoples coming together in unity. If you look at Paul's metaphor of the church as a body and its members, this is to emphasize how the church community is composed of individuals from various backgrounds with diverse gifts, and their unity and harmony is achieved in their confession of Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. The modern church and the church since the first century has often relied on authority to gain conformity instead of submission to Jesus to gain unity. This has little or nothing to do, really nothing else, so stop saying little, has nothing to do with what Jesus taught. It has everything to do with how men have abused that teaching. Now, as Jesus himself said, by everyone, he said, by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. The unity of his church should be a unity of love, not a unity of dogma. And another of Jesus's most celebrated statements is, if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. So, you know, I've been, as I was getting ready to do the show, of course, I had a post up that the show was coming and what the topic would be. And a lot of people were nice to grace me with a number of memes. And of course, they were mostly atheists, and they were somewhat memes that were trying to be kind of in your face, and that's fine. I'm content with addressing all of them, or actually all of them, I think, that went up. Maybe I missed one. Here's one that was great, and I think this is kind of fun. Insanity is when you believe your hallucinations are real. Religion is when you believe someone else's hallucinations are real. Well, I mean, that's cute, right? I mean, good job. But that really isn't what religion is. Religion is the understanding. Well, religions are organized systems. What Christianity is a relationship with God that transcends those things. So let's talk about science as the only way to prove anything, which is really the topic today. We're 18 minutes in. I'm looking at my notes, and I'm guessing that we're going to go either past 7, or I'm going to take a look at it where we are and decide to do a second set of this next week. We'll continue it depending. But I have a lot to cover, so let's get going. Science is the only way to prove anything. Is that true? Well, let's see. First thing we have to do to understand that is understand the scientific method and ask ourselves, does the scientific method have some limitations? So the next graphic I'm going to put up here is a graphic of the scientific method. And this graphic says, you know, the first thing is the purple up here in the upper right of it, form hypothesis, then test the hypothesis, analyze the data, interpret the data, publish results, retest, define the question, gather information. So it's a circular process, and it depends in fact on this hypothesis and testing a hypothesis thing, and then finding out whether or not you were able to prove the hypothesis. Let me read from Wikipedia what their definition is again. And the reason I use Wikipedia isn't because I think they're necessarily the best source, but because they are the accepted source by so many. Here is the definition from Wikipedia. It says the scientific method is an empirical method of acquiring knowledge that has characterized the development of science since at least the 17th century. It involves careful observation, applying rigorous skepticism about what's observed, given that cognitive assumptions can distort how one interprets the observation, which we're going to get into in a minute. It involves formulating hypotheses via induction based on such observations, experiment, and measurement-based testing of deductions drawn from hypothesis, and refinement or elimination of hypothesis based on the experimental findings. These are principles of the scientific method as distinguished from a definitive series of steps applicable to all scientific enterprises. So that's the definition. That we've all heard this probably since grade school. The scientific method: hypothesis, test hypothesis, see if your hypothesis was good. If your hypothesis wasn't good, start over with a new hypothesis. So this is so interesting because the scientific method is at some level a myth. Not that in that the scientific method itself doesn't work or isn't used, because it is used and it does work and it's valid and useful in a bunch of arenas, but there are arenas where it's not useful and people still try and call it science. And this is really important. There are a lot of fields of research and study that are not subject to the scientific method. So let's talk about some of those where the scientific method can't be used as a determinant of truth in a field of study or inquiry. Here's one. Cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology is the study of the past behaviors of people and what they did based on what we can find in the fossil record or in historical records and how cultures developed. Well, that's a field of study that's probably worth studying, and it's probably draws some conclusions that are valid and useful, but it is not subject to the scientific method because you can't do any experimentation. So all fields of paleontology, all of the things where we find dinosaur bones in the ground, and that doesn't mean that they're not dinosaur bones and that the information that we get from them isn't valid, but what it does mean is that you can't take a hypothesis and test it because you can't touch or see the animals when they were alive. So paleontology, paleobotany, anything like that is not subject to the scientific method. Here's another one. This is the one that made Stephen Hawking famous: theoretical physics. It's called theoretical physics. Okay, and the reason it's theoretical physics is because it's based on theories or hypothesis which they cannot test using the scientific method. So we can call it science if we want, and it may be a discipline of study, but it is not subject to the scientific method. Here's some more. Astronomy, astrophysics, these things are not subject to the scientific method. How about history? Let's just give some examples. The killing of Kennedy, World War II, Christopher Columbus coming to America, Amerigo Vespucci going around the south horn of South America. Which of these things can you test with the scientific method? How about what you had for breakfast? Can that be tested with the scientific method? It can't be tested with the scientific method. You can't hypothesize, experiment, and then have a repeatable experiment that concludes that the hypothesis was good, because any good scientific method application can be repeated over and over and over again when you're using the scientific method. Next, what about philosophy? Philosophy of life, philosophy of all kinds of things. Is philosophy subject to the scientific method? It's not. Does that mean it's not worth pursuing? No, but the scientism view that the only way to arrive at truth is that the scientific method is the only way. How about psychology? Is psychology subject to the scientific method? Talking about something fraught with bias of the people who are involved, both the subjects and the practitioners. Psychology is just fraught with bias, and you can't use the scientific method. Let me give you some more examples. How you feel about a given situation or topic. How you feel about it. What you think about it. Is that subject to scientific experimentation? How about why you feel that way? Is that subject to the scientific method? It's not. How about this? Do I love my wife? Do I love my children? Now, someone could say, well, I've seen how you treat your wife. I've seen how you treat your children. I can see that you love them. Or I've seen how you treat them. I can see that you don't love them. Well, what if I was an extremely good actor and I didn't love them and I treated them as though I did? Would the scientific method come to valid conclusions? It wouldn't. The scientific method does not apply to an awful lot of things. And this is why the idea of using the scientific method to prove the Bible is a fool's errand. By the same token, trying to use the Bible to prove science is just as much a fool's errand, because the Bible is not a science textbook. And the Bible is full of different kinds of literature and language. And for an expanded view of that, you should check out the last episode where I talk a lot about the kinds of literature, the styles of writing, the different parts of speech that are used in the Bible and how they are best understood. So I want to jump through some of these memes that came to me regarding people. These were atheists, particular one guy who put up a dozen of them, and he was really interested in trying to debunk what I was going to say before I said it, which I always find interesting that, people want to argue with me before they've heard me, and that's fine. I'd rather have people address specific things I said after I said them. But regardless, here are some of these things. If God created the sun on the fourth day, how had 4 days passed? Well, that's a pretty good question, isn't it? If God created the sun on the fourth day, how did 4 days pass? Well, one of the things we have to understand is that when it talks about days, especially in the early Genesis account, and you can have a view that it's a 7-day creation. That's fine. I don't. I think this is more like when we say, hey, back in the day. Back in the day doesn't mean back in one day. It means back in a time period that we are referencing. And so when it says, evening and morning, the first day, what God is doing is demonstrating back in the first period of time, this happened. In the second period of time, this happened. In the third period of time, this happened. And I don't believe, referencing necessarily a literal 6-day creation. Now, if it is referencing a 6-day creation and I'm wrong, that's fine with me. I'm okay being wrong about that. I'm not sure that is what the case is. The next meme that our nice friend put up was this, and it's on the 6,000 year concept. It says, science has already annihilated the very foundation of Christianity. How? According to the Bible, God made Adam and Eve when he created Earth 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Adam and Eve sinned, blah, 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 and so on. And then it goes on about the so-called, number of primates and so on. Well, and I'm sure that number of primates may be accurate. Here's the important point. The Bible does not make a claim at anywhere. There's no claim in the Bible that the earth is 6,000 years old. There's no claim in the Bible that mankind is only 6,000 years old. This is something that is assembled by people from taking the genealogies in the Bible and adding them together. And in many cases, we have the number of years someone lived. In some cases, we don't, and they used 40 years as a generation or averaged out. And the reality is that we have to do that, we have to assume that the entire record of all of those people was perfectly accurate. And it's more likely than not perfectly accurate. When it says so-and-so begat so-and-so, well, I could say you could say I begat my grandson, because I did. He came from me, if you will. But my daughter and son-in-law were in between. Or in the case of my son's sons, my sons were in between. And so, we could say that my dad begat my grandchildren, and it wouldn't be inaccurate unless it means directly a son. And it doesn't mean that. So this is important because the age of mankind is often used as a point of dispute. Here's another meme that our nice friend put up. It says the oldest found Homo sapien fossil is 195,000 years old. Written language is only 8,000 years old. Mankind existed for over 187,000 years without religious books. So why do you think the truth can be found through religious books? Well, when God started revealing himself to mankind has absolutely nothing to do with how long mankind has been here. No matter what these guys on the other side say, scientists recognize someone who was called, in their parlance, not the parlance of Bible people, she's called mitochondrial Eve. which they believe must have been the first woman from whom offspring came forward. And so obviously, no matter whether it was 6,000 years ago or 195,000 years ago, there was in fact a first man and a first woman. And the story of Genesis does tell a story of the first man and the first woman. So the Bible never makes a claim that the earth is 6,000 years old, or that mankind has only been here 6,000 years. The next one, I love this. They can find dinosaur bones from 200 million years old, but they can't find the remains of any biblical characters from up to 4,000 years old. Well, that may in fact be partially true, but if you look at the episode I did 2 episodes ago on archaeology in the Bible, I think what you'll find is that they have found evidence not only of the cities and civilizations described in the Bible, but of a number of the Bible characters and individuals themselves have been found in the fossil record. So at one point, those hadn't been discovered, and this claim would have been true. Unfortunately, the people who are just convinced at being against Christianity and against the Bible are not keeping up with the research. Here's another one. The Exodus is a myth. It says, they say, no trace of the passage of a large group of people, 600,000 families, according to Exodus 12:37, has been found by archaeologists. And of course, a PhD in archaeology says if they get upset, I don't care. This is my career as an archaeologist. I should tell them the truth. If people are upset, that's not my problem. Well, that I agree with everything there, except that there's no trace of the Exodus. If you look at the episode 2 episodes ago, so that would have been episode 3, I do share the evidence for the Exodus that has in fact been found. So the Exodus is not a myth. And I'm going to deal with just these memes to get them out of the way, and then we'll get into some of the stuff that I had planned already. Bats aren't birds. This one I especially like. God said, from among the birds that shall not be eaten are the bats in Deuteronomy. And, fact, bats are mammals, not birds. And so that's a fail, right? Well, again, the Bible is not a science textbook, not intended to be a science textbook. It was written to a relatively primitive people, and God was giving them an idea of what was safe to eat. Now, God's purpose was not to give them a genus, species taxonomy. It was to basically say, of the things that are flying, here's what I don't want you to eat. Okay. And for the primitive man, and no matter what you think, the early Bible characters were primitive people in so many ways. They absolutely didn't make a distinction between a bat and a bird. They were all just creatures of the air. Importantly, even for us as modern men, the idea of genus and species, binomial nomenclature, Homo sapiens, right, was not something that really happened until Joseph Pitton de Tournefort, a French botanist. He lived 1656 to 1708. He was the guy who came up with the idea of modern taxonomy, genus and species. So this idea is only 400 years old or so, 500 years old at the max, and 400, I guess. And so the idea that the Bible times people should have had that information is no more relevant than the idea that the people at the time of the King James Bible or of the settlement of America when the first settlers came here, or Columbus in 1492, which those people were relatively modern compared to the Bible characters. So the idea of genus and species being something that would have made a distinction between mammals and birds back in the time when the Bible was offered to people as a guide for life is really somewhat foolish. And, it was 1753 when Linnaeus popularized the idea of genus species in his published series Species Plantarum. And so I don't think it's any kind of an indictment of Scripture that God spoke to these people in terms that they could understand and take advantage of. Here's another one. This was again, some of these are just, for me, they're fun because they're just they're grounded and rooted in a juvenile understanding of the scripture, in my view. How did animals get their stripes? Well, science. Over a long period, any animal has small changes in their coloring. Some color changes allow animals to survive better than others of their species. These small changes piled up over time, resulting in a coloring scheme that helped the animal survive and reproduce. This is how animals got their stripes and other color schemes. Bible. Well, Jacob carved stripes and spots into his tree and put his herd in front of them, and when they mated, they gave birth, and their babies had stripes and spots. Well, first of all, this is an absolute mischaracterization of what the Bible says, and then we'll talk about the science that supports it. So I'm going to read to you the Bible verses here that are relevant. Jacob was committed to serving Laban, and Laban was kind of a flim-flam man. He had been dishonest and unreliable in his deals with Jacob, and so Jacob made a deal with him. Said, "Look, I'll tend your flock, and anything that comes out pure of color you can have, and anything that's speckled or spotted I'll take for myself." So that was the deal. And so here Jacob is looking after Laban's flocks, and the question here is, did the animals look at a tree and that's how they got their stripes? Does the Bible say that? Well, it doesn't say that. Let me just tell you what it says. Jacob took branches from white poplar trees, freshly cut almond trees, and some other trees, stripped off their bark to make white streaks, and uncovered the white part inside the branches. Then he placed the branches that he had stripped bare in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink. So if you will, you can see these branches with strips of bark removed and some strips of bark remaining. He threw them into the watering trough. He placed the branches in front of the flock, and when they went into heat as they came to drink. When the flocks mated in front of the branches, they would bear offspring that were striped, speckled, or spotted. Jacob kept the lambs separate, facing the striped and the entirely black ones that belonged to Laban's flock. He set his own herd by itself and would not let them be with Laban's flock. Whenever the more vigorous of the flock came into heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the flock to make them mate by the branches, but he didn't put branches in front of any of the feeble members of the flock. As a result, the feeble ones belonged to Laban, but the stronger ones belonged to Jacob. What this really describes is selective breeding. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of the actual idea of the epigenetics behind this right here. So at the first reading, it sounds like, well, he put the striped branches in front of the animals, and because they saw striped branches when they were eating, that's why they changed from solid to striped. Well, that's really not what's happening here, not what it's saying. Coloring is not determined by what the parents of the animals see during intercourse. When you look further down, and it talks about him putting the strong ones there and putting the branches in front, and the weak ones there, not putting the branches in front, what we get is the idea that the stronger animals were more successful in breeding. Okay, now, the flock tended by Jacob had only monochrome animals with respect to phenotype. So when he started, he had Laban's flock, and all of the animals were just one color. Okay, they were the dark black goats, and he wanted to have. Laban said that Jacob could have any that came out speckled, spotted, or brown. And Laban thought that since they were black goats, they would only have black offspring. Well, there are recessive genes in every group, and the fact that there were already striped, speckled, and spotted in the group that was allowed to stay with Jacob was an indicator that the recessive genes were present. Now, what we know now from modern views of goats is that 33% were pure monochromes. 33% of any herd are generally pure monochromes. They're called homozygotes, which means they don't have the recessive gene for speckles and spots and to turn brown or to give brown offspring. But 66% of those that express just solid color are what they call heterozygotes. They contain the recessive gene of spottedness. And so when you cross the heterozygotes among themselves, you get spotted, speckled, and striped sheep as 2/3 of the offspring. Now, it's also known, this is important, that a 2008 paper by a guy named Joshua Bacon, he's from the Department of Pharmaceutics at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, he published examining this in light of epigenetics. In the paper, Bacon shows that prenatal nutrition can affect the agouti gene that regulates fur color in sheep and mice. So the flocks were sheep and goats, right? The fungi that resides in the bark of these specific types of branches of the poplar and almond provide chemicals that comprise the exact amino acids needed to create alterations in the color of fur without changing even the DNA. So both the branches made them more fertile and more likely to produce striped, spotted, and speckled offspring. Had nothing to do with whether the sheep or goats visualized the branches. Now, back to our memes. Our good friend also posted this. Love this. Again, thank you for entertaining me with some of these things. This one says, "You have skin cancer. God forgot to protect you from the sun." Well, is that what happened? And of course, the verse cited here is, "The Lord will guard you. He is by your side to protect you. The sun will not hurt you during the day, nor the moon during the night." Well, here's the whole section of scripture. Psalm 121, which if you saw the last episode or checked it out, Psalms is poetic, and poetic language is symbolic more often than not. The whole section here says, "I'll lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence comes my help. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to be moved." Is that true? That God doesn't allow your foot to be moved? What does it mean? It means you won't be dislodged from your place in the world, if you will. "He who keeps you will not slumber." Well, we know that God doesn't sleep. And this is just emphasizing the point. "Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand." Well, the Lord doesn't have a physical body, so the Lord can't be your shade in any way. "The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night." So what does that mean? The sun shall not strike you by day. It means that none of the great powers will have an impact on the nation of Israel. This is not a promise to any individual person to keep them out of the sun. It's saying that the powers, greater or lesser, that surround you won't strike the nation of Israel. "The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forward." The key in this whole thing is verse 4 there, "Behold, he who keeps Israel." The section is about the keeping of Israel and the preservation of Israel and as a nation, and the preservation of Israel as a people, and the people within as a result. So this meme that our good friend offered was just a juvenile view of this, and I guess I missed the thing to cut this over. But so the key again there, "The Lord is your keeper, the Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day," is not implying that no one could get sunburned or no one could get skin cancer from exposure to the sun. Now, let's go on here. Let me quote some famous evolutionists, because we're going to talk about evolution somewhat briefly. Maybe at a little more extent than some of you would like, depending on how much you like detail. This will be somewhat detailed, and we'll see how it goes here. And again, I may have to extend this episode on to the next one, but let's see. So what I want to do is, rather than quote people who are not evolutionists, let's not quote the creationists who deny evolution here to give evidence. Let me quote some evolutionists for you. Okay. First is Kimball, published in 2013 in the journal called Paleoanthropology. And the title of the article is "Hesitation on Hominin History." Okay. Actually, this was published in Nature. The title of the article, Paleoanthropology, Hesitation on Hominin History. Here's what the good Dr. Kimball has to say. The evolutionary events that led to the origin of the Homo lineage are an enduring puzzle in paleoanthropology, chiefly because the fossil record from between 3 and 2 million years ago is frustratingly sparse, especially in Eastern Africa. So the very place where they would expect to find evidence of human evolution, they're not finding it at any level, first. And second of all, back to our discussion of the scientific method, it isn't subject to it. It's not science. It is taking the information they have and making their best inference from it. And in this case, he's saying that we have no evidence for the inference that we've made. Next, Dr. Wong. This is in the Scientific American magazine in 2012. The title of the article, First of Our Kind, Could Australopithecus sabita, there we are back to genus species, be our long lost ancestor? Dr. Wong says, but with so little evidence to go on, the origin of our genus has remained as mysterious as ever. Leading evolutionists saying that the record is frustratingly sparse. The origin of our genus has remained as mysterious as ever. Next, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in an article called Did Early Homo Migrate Out of or Into Africa? Dr. Wood, the author, says, quote, the origin of our own genus remains frustratingly unclear. So leading evolutionists in recent publications are saying, we basically have no evidence for the conclusion we've drawn that man evolved from apes. Okay, so now they may be right in the end, and those of us who don't believe that men have evolved from apes may be wrong, but I don't think so. And again, you can draw your own conclusion, but your conclusions will not be based on science. They will not be based on the scientific method. They will be based on a preference of what to believe. And at this point, the record supports the idea of man being a created being much more than the record supports the idea of evolution. In fact, Darwin postulated that evolution was gradualism, that it happened slowly over time. And that idea has been really almost entirely abandoned in modern study of evolution. Even the evolutionists make a claim now of something called punctuated equilibrium, that things just happened all at once, not that they were gradual. That, in other words, we were lucky enough to have two identical mutations happen, male and female, at the same time in such a way that they were able to produce offspring. One of the arguments of genus species is the idea is that there is no interspecies breeding. That's part of what makes a species, is that it can't breed with things that aren't its species, even within the same genus. So, next, doesn't DNA prove similarity? Have you guys heard the argument that man's DNA is effectively 85% or some percentage the same as chimpanzee DNA? We've all heard this argument, right? So there's no paleontological evidence. Paleontology can't prove it. And so what they've turned to is DNA as an attempt to prove it. Well, what is DNA? We know what it is, right? It's a double-stranded molecule, and under certain conditions, it can be denatured, which means broken apart, unzipped, to make it single-stranded, and then even allowed to zip back up. So during the initial stages of DNA science in the early 70s, there were some pretty crude and indirect techniques utilized to unzip mixtures of human and chimp DNA, and then they were monitored to see how fast they would zip back up compared to unmixed samples. So the idea was, if we break these things apart and put them back together to allow them to zip back up, if they do it rapidly, there's similarity. If they don't do it rapidly, there's not similarity. Well, maybe that's a good idea, but it turned out not to be true. Based on those studies, they declared that human and chimpanzee DNA was 98.5% similar. But only the most similar protein coding regions of the genome, called the single copy DNA, were compared, which is only less than 3% of the total genome. So they took 3% and said, well, that zips up pretty fast, so therefore 95% of the whole. Not such a great way to conclude things. It's really more extrapolation and inference than it is observational data. It was later discovered that the authors of these studies had manipulated the data to make the chimp DNA appear more similar to human DNA than it really was. And by the way, for those of you skeptics who are watching, this is all footnoted in the show notes that will be at thefootlight.com. The sources for the information are all there. Feel free to check them out yourself. Now, these initial studies, and again, back in the 70s, not only established a fraudulent gold standard of 98.5% DNA similarity between humans and chimps, but it also established the shady practice of cherry-picking only the most similar data. The idea of nearly identical human and chimp DNA was born, and it was used to bolster the myth of human evolution, in my opinion, something that the lack of fossil evidence was unable to accomplish. Now, DNA sequencing has become much more advanced, right? Scientists were able to compare the actual order of DNA bases, the nucleotides, between DNA sequences from different creatures. This is done in a process in which similar DNA segments could be directly matched up or aligned, and then those differences were calculated. And there wasn't much progress made in comparing large regions of DNA between chimps and humans until the genomics revolution, really, or in the early part of this century. Which gave an emphasis on developing new technologies to sequence the human genome. Okay, so between 2002 and 2005, a variety of reports was published that on the surface seemed to support the 98.5% DNA similarity myth. However, the researchers were only including data on the most highly aligning sequences and omitting gaps and regions that did not align. Once again, we have the same old problem of cherry-picking the data that supports evolution while ignoring the data that doesn't. However, at least 3 of these papers describe the amount of non-similar data that was thrown out. When those missing data were included in the original numbers, the overall DNA similarity between humans and chimps dropped to 81 to 87%, depending on which of those 3 papers. Hold on, I got to get another drink of water here. Lots of talking, right? Okay, let's keep going. Now, determining DNA similarity between humans and chimps is not a trivial thing. One of the main problems with the current chimpanzee genome is that it wasn't constructed on its own merits. When DNA is sequenced, it's produced in millions of small pieces that have to be stitched together with powerful computers. In large mammalian genomes like the chimpanzee, this isn't easy. And especially since very few genetic resources exist to aid in the effort compared to those available for the Human Genome Project. Now, the Human Genome Project, for perspective, given all the information that we have today and all of the computers we have today, this project was launched in 1990. When was it completed? Last month, March of 2022. 32 years is what it took. With the biggest computers and the best minds in the field, it took 32 years to sequence human DNA. You can look it up. Time magazine, the article just published April 2nd or April 1st, I think 2 days ago, the article published that they had finally completed the human genome after 32 years. So there aren't the same kinds of resources allowed or applied or funded for chimpanzee research. Along with the evolutionary bias, the chimpanzee genome, you're going to love this, was put together with the human genome as a guide or a scaffold onto which little DNA sequence snippets were organized and stitched together. I'm going to have a visual on that coming up here in a minute. The current chimpanzee genome appears much more human-like than it really is. In fact, a study by Tompkins, and again, this is all footnoted, showed that individual raw chimpanzee DNA sequences that had poor similarity to human sequences or aligned very poorly onto the chimpanzee genome that had been assembled assembled them in the wrong place on the genome because they used the human framework. Now, another serious problem with the chimpanzee genome is that it appears to contain significant levels of human DNA contamination. When DNA samples are prepared for the laboratory in the lab for sequencing, it's common to have DNA from human lab workers get into the samples. Several studies show that many non-primate DNA sequence databases contain significant levels of human DNA. Now, a recent study shows that a little over half of the data sets used to construct the chimp genome contain significantly higher levels of human DNA than the others. The data sets with apparent high levels of human DNA contamination were the ones utilized during the first phase of the project that led to the famous 2005 chimpanzee genome publication. So the contaminated sets led to this set of data that showed that the humans and chimps are similar. Now, the data sets produced after this were added on top of the ones already in the initial assembly. So they started with a corrupt genome, or corrupt material, and instead of starting fresh with new material, they've added to it. So not only was the chimpanzee genome assembled using the human genome as a pattern or a scaffold, but research indicates that it was constructed with significant levels of human DNA included. This would explain why raw, unassembled chimp DNA sequences can't be aligned onto the chimpanzee genome with high accuracy. It's considerably more human-like than it should be. So, how similar is chimp DNA to human? Well, again, Dr. Tompkins' research indicates that raw chimp DNA sequences from data sets with significantly lower levels of human DNA contamination are on average 85% identical in their DNA sequence when aligned onto the human genome. Therefore, based on the most recent, unbiased, and comprehensive research, chimp DNA is no more than 85% similar to human. Well, that's a lot, right? I mean, that's a lot. Come on. This is a big deal. Well, let me just give you some graphics on this that may help explain the issue here. So I've just grabbed two paragraphs. These two paragraphs are from the recent article about the human genome's completion from Time magazine. And the content of the paragraphs doesn't matter that much. I want to show you what I did with them. And this is just an illustration to give you an idea of how they assembled the chimp DNA, the chimp genome on top of the human genome. What I did is I took the first paragraph and the second paragraph, and I won't bother to read them. But what I want you to notice is that there are up here red letters in the first one and red letters here. There are some numbers up here in the first paragraph. There are some capital letters in the first paragraph. And what I did is I just reduced each of these to their unique characters. Down here you see science is in italics. I considered the italicized C as a different character from the non-italicized C. And then what I did is just reduced each down to the string of characters that were in them. Okay. And again, this is not the same way this was done. I did this for purpose of example. There are 52 separate characters used in the first paragraph. There are 31 separate characters used in the second paragraph. The green characters here, the ones I covered in green, are characters that appear in the second one that don't appear in the first one. So there are 31 characters, 24 of them are the same, 7 uniques, so 24 into 52. These paragraphs are 46% the same. I mean, come on. Can't you tell the similarity between them? They're not similar in very many respects. Now, the next thing to align it onto the scaffolding would be to take this first sentence, okay, the characters of the first one and the characters of the second one. If you align them identically on one another, just line them up one next to the other, you see that there are total of 5 characters, the M here, and the A, that align in the same place. But what they did in scaffolding onto human DNA is they took the available DNA pieces and they put them in the same places, scaffolding them onto the human DNA. I guess I missed the U here and turning it purple. But the idea here is they scaffolded the chimp DNA onto the human DNA to make their claim. And so does it match 46%? No, in this case, using this example, 5 out of 52 is 10%. Now, this isn't what they did, and I don't mean to say that this is exactly how it was done. The point is to provide an example of you can show similarity, you can show similarity of location, and then by rearranging, which is what they did with the chimpanzee genome, you can show even more similarity if you want to try and do that. The reality is that that is not the same as comparing one to the other. When you compare one to the other, you don't find very much similarity. So what does 85% DNA similarity really mean? Well, first of all, it's important to know that for human evolution to seem plausible, for human evolution from chimps to work, a DNA similarity of 99% would be required. Again, this is from Tompkins. This is based on known current mutation rates in humans and the alleged splitting of humans from a common ancestor with chimpanzees 3 to 6 million years ago. So if that was the time of the split, as they claim, the rate of mutation would be insufficient to get us from 85% to 100% in the time frame allowed. The length of time is a mere second on the evolutionary time scale. So any level of similarity below 99% makes evolution of chimps to man impossible. And this is why evolutionists rely on all sorts of, forgive the term here, monkey business when it comes to comparing human and chimp DNA. They have to achieve a figure close to 99% or the entire argument, the entire model collapses. So now, what if, in fact, humans and chimps are 85% similar in their DNA, and it appears to be the argument? That's pretty close, right? I mean, even if it puts evolution out of the picture on the time scale, they say maybe the time scale is wrong, and if you knocked over my water almost, if you allowed more time, then it would work, right? Well, the similarity is exactly what one would expect when you consider a designer and the design product. Let me give you an example. If you look at cars, for a lack of a better thing to look at, you can tell the front end of a Mercedes one from another. You can tell the styling of a Mercedes-Benz one from another. Same with Toyota products or Ford products. You can tell they're similar in the way they look. They're similar in the way they function. Why? Did a Ford Mustang turn into a Ford Bronco? Did an F-150 turn into a Bronco? Did a Ford Ranger evolve into a Ford F-150? Did a Mercedes C-Class evolve into an E-Class? No, they come from the same designers. We would expect the same designers to use the same design principles involved. This is one of the best arguments, not against creation, but for creation. The similarities in overall body plans, the similarities in cellular physiology between humans and chimps, and even in the mitochondria of the cell in all living things is evidence not of random mutation, but random evidence of a common designer, in my view. After all, DNA isn't called the genetic code for nothing. Just as software programs on a computer have similar sections of code because they perform similar functions, the same similarity exists between different creatures in certain sections of their genomes because the same code is required to perform the same function. This doesn't mean that one computer program evolved from another. It does mean that the designers of those programs used common functional elements in both of the programs for purposes of achieving the same end. It's not evidence that one evolved from another, but rather that both were created along similar engineering or design principles. For example, we've all seen watches and clocks that run on clockworks. Well, those clockworks are all very, very similar in design, very similar in operation, but it doesn't mean that one evolved from the other. So the fact that differences in these DNA sequences are unexplained by the evolutionary process really gives strong evidence for design, in my view. Now, the Bible says that every living thing was created according to its kind. And this does fit the clear, observable boundaries we see in nature between types of creatures. as well as the distinct boundaries that are found by researchers in researching genomes and DNA sequencing. So the Bible says that everything's created according to its kind, and that is actually what we see in the evidence when we look at DNA. Now, in regard to humans, not only are we distinctly different compared to chimpanzees and other apes, we also are the one part of creation that stands out above all living forms, because the Bible states, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Even the evolutionists agree that there was a first man and a first woman somewhere along the way, and that they were unique and special amongst all creation. Even the evolutionists admit to that. So not only is evolution a false paradigm lacking scientific support, it also directly attacks one of the key paradigms in the Bible. Humanity's unique creation in God's image is foundational to the reason that Jesus Christ came to redeem us. Man became corrupt through sin from his created state. He did not evolve from an ape. And again, the footnotes for all of this are in the show notes for those of you who are doubters. You can look at the scientific and peer-reviewed published research that supports everything I just said. Now, some more scientific proofs in the Bible that I think are probably useful. The Earth floats in space. We know that, right? Now, 1,500 years before Christ, a lot of people believe that the Earth sat on a large animal or a giant. Okay, and this was really believed up until 1650, when finally we understood that the Earth is free-floating in space and revolves around the sun. This was Galileo, right? So in Job 26:7, the Bible says, "He stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth upon nothing." Not sitting on an animal, not held up by some great giant being. The earth hangs upon nothing. Job is considered to be the oldest book in the Bible, written before Genesis, written before the Pentateuch. Now, how about this? Washing your hands. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, a young doctor in 1845 discovered the importance of washing. A major problem was that the death rate among women giving birth in hospitals was really high. In some years, the death rate of women giving birth was 30% after giving birth. And in centuries past, doctors didn't wash their hands before going to the next patient. This was because microscopic diseases weren't yet discovered. When it was discovered that washing hands would help stop the spread of disease, the death rate of pregnant women dropped to 2%. However, the Bible already taught how to deal with diseases by washing much earlier than science. In Leviticus 15:13, it says, "Now when the man with the discharge," this is anyone with a sore that was weeping, right? "When the man with the discharge becomes cleansed from his discharge," from his infection, if you will, "then he shall count off for himself 7 days for his cleansing. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water and will become clean." So the Bible taught about infectious diseases way before the 1850s. The circle of the earth. People used to think that the earth was flat, right? And then it was Greek, some people still do. It was the Greek philosophers who first concluded that the earth was round. I can't say this guy's name, Eratosthenes, I guess I should have practiced that. Aristotle and Pythagoras all wrote about this theory as early as 500 BC. However, many years earlier, the Bible already revealed this truth. In the book of Isaiah, written between 740 and 680 BC, it said, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in." So he, God, sits above the circle of the earth, was in Isaiah, way before the ancient Greeks even thought about it. The Bible and oceanography. 200 years ago, a guy named Matthew Maury. Matthew Maury, let's see, where was I going with this? Yeah, back to this other view. Sorry. Doing too much here. Matthew Maury, back in 200 years ago, so the late 1800s. Matthew Morey said he was called the father of oceanography, and he noticed that the Bible verse Psalm 8:8 described the path of the seas. And so because he was a Christian believer, he wanted to find those paths that God said were in the Word. And he discovered the warm and cold continental currents. His book on oceanography is still used in universities. And the verse in Psalm 8:8 says, "The birds of the heaven and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the seas." Psalms 8:8. First law of thermodynamics. Nothing is evolving and everything is finished just as the Bible says. Genesis 2:1 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished." And this was a nice meme that somebody put up. If God finished creating the whole universe in 6 days and rested, why do we still have new planets and stars forming today? Well, does it mean that God didn't have any creative activity after the creation? I mean, I think I was created by God and I'm way after the creation. I think God is still creating things. What it means is that the universe and the earth as they are and the systems and processes set up in it were finished being created. And that would include the processes of star creation and star destruction out there in the universe. God created the universe and then stopped his creative activity in terms of forming entirely new things. Again, the Bible in quarantine. Before medical science found out about the importance of isolating a person with infectious disease, God taught people about that in the Bible. In the 14th century, 70 million people died through the Black Plague because they failed to separate the sick from the healthy. It wasn't until the 17th century that the laws of quarantine were started. But well before modern medicine, we've become all too familiar with this in the last couple of years, God instructed his people to do this with their sick. Leviticus 13:46 says, "As long as he has the infection, he remains unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp." Next, the Bible in dinosaurs. Were dinosaurs around when people were around? Well, some people say yes, some people say no. Depends on, you can see this however you want to see it. I'm just going to share with you what the Bible says. The Bible talks about a creature called behemoth. Some think this was a hippopotamus, but the hippo doesn't fit the account, neither does an elephant. And because the characteristic of the massive animal is that it had a tail like a cedar. And the hippo and the elephant, neither one do. Job 40:15-24 says, "Look at behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are close knit. Its bones are tubes of bronze. Its limbs like rods of iron. It ranks first among the works of God. Yet its maker can approach it with his sword." That's its maker, God, right? "The hills bring it their produce, and all the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plants it lies, hidden among the reeds and the marshes. The lotuses conceal it in their shadow. The poplars by the stream surround it. A raging river does not alarm it. It is secure, though the Jordan should surge against its mouth. Can anyone capture it by the eyes or trap it and pierce its nose?" So this animal was so large that it could, bones of bronze, right? And yet the other animals were secure near it. So it was probably an herbivore, more likely than not a brontosaurus. Now, people can say, well, there were no dinosaurs at the same time as people. Well, okay, let's say that I agree with that. Then where would this description have come from? For those of you who believe that the Bible is just a myth that men made up, why would men have made up a myth like this of an animal that was this large? Unless it was out of their own experience. Another question you have to ask is, why are there, every society that we know of through paleontology, every cave society that had cave drawings or other kinds of, carvings has dragons? Why is it that everyone has these very large reptiles that show up in the mythology of literally every society on Earth if man and dinosaurs weren't around at the same time? There are some real problems with the dating systems that date these things, and you can look into that on your own. I'm not going to get into that on this episode. But they have found fossilized hats from the 18th century. They found fossilized tools from the times that people were dredging the Mississippi Delta, and things became lodged in the mud, and they have become fossilized. And when carbon dated, they show that they're millions of years old, but we know that they're modern tools. Another evidence in the Bible, another thing the Bible says that came from recent discovery, if you will, the planet's core is hot. We're still exploring the planet's core and don't really know exactly what it consists of. Job 28:5, again, the oldest book of the Bible, says, the earth from which food comes is transformed below as by fire. And again, the Bible's not a science textbook, but it references things that science have now confirmed. Water changes state, what we call the water cycle, right? Known as the hydrologic cycle. Well-known phenomenon? Well, turns out the Bible mentions it more than once. Ecclesiastes 1:7. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Where do the streams come from? From rain. They flow into the sea and they return again to the rain. Amos 9:6 also mentions it. It says he calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. Job 36:27, he draws up the drops of water, which distill as rain to the streams. The clouds pour down their moisture, and abundant showers fall on mankind. Psalm 135:7, he makes clouds rise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning with the rain and brings out the wind from his storehouses. So the idea here of the hydrologic cycle also appears in the Bible fairly consistently. Now, let's talk about Noah's flood, because this is a common thing that people love to, try and claim the Bible's not true because of. Here's, again, a meme from our good friend who posted all these memes. Let me just get to where I can read it on the thing I have here on the example of the screen. I can't read it, so I got to change this up here, and there we go. So according to biblical chronology as calculated by James Ussher, the world was destroyed by a flood in 2348 BC. 4 couples survived, including one who was 600 years old. The Great Pyramid in Egypt was built 2560 to 2540 BC before the flood, yet miraculously survived this global catastrophe intact. Knowing this could not be correct. Christians want to believe the pyramids were actually built 100 to 150 years after the flood, a view not supported by archaeology. Even so, how in the hell did 4 couples have enough offspring in 150 years to build the pyramids? Well, that's a pretty good question, right? I mean, that's a real challenge. Obviously, that can't be the case, right? Well, the first question is, should we take the 2,500-year timeline that the James Ussher, whoever that is, said? I don't feel compelled to take the timeline of history from the genealogies that we have in the Bible, because I don't believe that the genealogies are intended to be exhaustive. So I'm personally not going to add those up. Now, you may, and that's fine, but I don't think that works. Now, 2 geologists at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory have offered a new theory of the flood. William Ryer and Walter Pittman, in a book called Noah's Flood, published by Simon & Schuster, here's what they postulate: that after the Ice Age, as the world warmed, the glaciers retreated and meltwater from the European glaciers began to flow into the North Sea. This deprived the Black Sea of its main source of replenishment. The level of the Black Sea began to drop, and most of the area around its northern boundary, this area adjacent to the present-day Crimea and the Sea of Azov, became dry land. At this point, the level of the Black Sea was several hundred feet below that of the Mediterranean, and the two were separated by the barrier of Bosporus, then dry land. This situation, with the world ocean rising while the Black Sea was falling, couldn't last forever. Eventually, like a bathtub overflowing, the Mediterranean had to pour through into the Black Sea basin. It was this event that Pittman and Ryan believe could be the flood recorded in the book of Genesis. The salt water poured through the deepening channel, creating a waterfall 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, which, if you've ever been to the Niagara Falls, that's a lot. In a single day, enough water came through the channel to cover Manhattan to a depth at least 2 times the height of the World Trade Center. Let me say that again. In a single day, enough water came through the channel to cover Manhattan to a depth at least 2 times the height of the World Trade Center. And the roar of the cascading water would have been audible at least 100 miles away. Anyone living in the fertile farmlands on the north rim of the sea would have had the harrowing experience of seeing the boundary of the ocean move inland at the rate of a mile a day. So the question in the table is, was the flood a worldwide phenomenon? You can decide what you think. I tend to lean toward it being a regional phenomenon. Very often in the Bible, we have to understand the parts of speech. And again, last episode dealt with this when it says that all of Judea came out to be baptized by John. We know that King Herod, who was king of Judea, didn't come out to be baptized by John. The Bible is replete with hyperbole. When it says all the earth, it likely wasn't all the earth. It was all the earth there where those people were, where they had become exceedingly wicked, where they had stopped serving God as he intended. That's more likely, to my view, what it means. You can define that however you want. The next of these little memes about this, and this is interesting because naturalist atheists want to say 2 things at once. They want to say that mankind didn't exist when the dinosaurs existed, and then they publish this. Well, there's one saying that mankind existed when the dinosaurs existed. I'm just going to say this, guys. You atheists are going to have to make up your mind how it was. And to my mind, the flood is one of the most plausible arguments for the end of the dinosaurs, if it was, in fact, a worldwide flood. Now, here's something else we know. The ark itself would have worked. According to Genesis 16:32, God's instructions to Noah were as followed. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Well, if it turns out the math is correct, according to calculations made by physics students at the University of Leicester in 2014, the ark would have actually floated and safely carried pairs of each animal species through the flood. So now this idea of Noah's ark preserving all of the animals of the earth, we can believe that if we want to believe that it's a worldwide flood. That's fine. I don't necessarily believe that, but you can. And I'm not. If I'm wrong, it's fine with me. I'm wrong a lot. Ask Mrs. O'Kelly. But the reality is that the story here is really to demonstrate, in my view, that God wanted to show that man should be, if you will, an environmentalist, that man should be, in fact, taking care of the creation that God gave. What Adam is told is to tend the earth. And so the idea of mankind caring for the animals through that flood is really demonstrative of God saying one more time, hey, it's your responsibility to, if you will, husband the earth. Few more, and then I think we'll be done. I think we won't have to split this in 2, although this will be a longer episode. That's fine. There are countless stars in the sky. We know that the universe has a lot of stars, right? And by a lot, we're talking about up to 1 trillion stars per galaxy. It's estimated that there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe. That's way too many for anybody to count, right? The Bible actually mentions this in Jeremiah 33:22. I will make the descendants of David my servant and the Levites who minister before me as countless as the stars in the sky and as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Now, does that mean that literally David's descendants will be countless? Well, I don't know if you could count them today with all of the intermarriage that's happened, but the reality is that it would be a daunting task to count the stars or the sand or the descendants of David, and that is the point. The Bible also mentions that stars' brightness or magnitude varies. In 1 Corinthians 15:41, I believe, says the sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another, and stars differ from star in splendor. I didn't footnote this right, so that could be 1st or 2nd Corinthians. I'm not sure which one. Now we know that stars and other astronomical bodies die. We've seen dying stars in astronomy and stars being born. And Matthew 24:35 reads, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." So the heavens passing away is something that the Bible speaks about. We know that the universe is made up of these invisible particles called atoms, right? We do know that. Hebrews 11:3 reads, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so what is seen was not made out of what was visible." The visible was made out of what was invisible. It does sound like the Bible's talking about atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons. On their own are invisible to the naked eye. Atoms make up pretty much everything, including us. David could have actually defeated Goliath. A small boy defeating a giant might sound unlikely, but the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17 does say that David beat the giant. Now, a slingshot, probably not the most powerful weapon, but it probably wasn't a slingshot like with a rubber band. It was a sling like you would swing around and then release, and this was commonly used for hunting. Guys became very good at aiming a sling. And David was known for having killed other animals with his sling. And the stones from the Elah Valley, where Goliath of Gath would have come from and this battle would have happened, they're made of barium sulfate, super dense. And again, if a sling hits a guy in his skull with it, it is going to break his skull. And that's exactly how they would hunt animals with it. They would hit them in a place where it would do sufficient damage that the animal either couldn't escape, break their leg, break their shoulder, somehow where they couldn't run, or hit them in the head and kill them. And there's more. Being a giant, Goliath likely suffered from something called acromegaly, which is an overproduction of growth hormone. This is a known phenomenon. It can cause problems with vision, and peripheral vision can be limited, which would have been handy for David. There are mountains underwater. These landforms are actually called seamounts, and the Bible talks about them. Psalm 104:6 reads, "You covered it with the watery depths with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains." The sun actually appears to stop moving. Joshua 10:12 reads, "On the last day the Lord gave the Amorites, on the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, 'Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Aijalon.'" Well, this was most likely an eclipse, which researchers have dated back to October 30th, 1207 BC. Now, last two things and we're done. Creatures can't live without blood. Most of us are familiar with the Adam and Eve story of the Bible, right? And again, evolutionists have in fact a female biological ancestor that evolutionists call mitochondrial Eve. They say that this is actually the first or the necessary precursor to our species, Homo sapiens. However, there is one thing that connects all of us living creatures, and that is blood. Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I've given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." Now, last of these memes that were supplied by my good friend here, who shared a bunch of memes with us. Let's grab it here, and it says, this is the verse that proves that Jesus lied. Well, of course it doesn't, but Matthew 16:27 and 28 says, "For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they've done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And so was Jesus just a liar? Did he tell people he was going to come in his kingdom and then he didn't? Is that what happened? Well, again, you have to understand what Bible language means. And Jesus said that the end of the age, in Matthew 24, the same book, the end of the age would come before this generation passes away. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, does this generation mean up until now from then, or does it mean this generation? And what do we mean by the king coming in glory and the end of the age? Well, the Jewish temple and the Jewish sacrifice system was ended in 70 AD when the Romans came in and sacked Jerusalem and killed people. It was super bloody and destroyed the temple. This is, in my view, what Jesus is speaking of as the end of the age that would happen within this generation. And the end of the age and the signs of your coming is what the apostles had asked. And so Jesus came in judgment, if you will. Although he didn't physically return in the sense of the second coming, he used the Romans to judge Israel after giving them an opportunity to accept the new covenant. And he gave them an entire generation to get it right, the same way that an entire generation who had gotten it wrong in their worship of the golden calf ended up wandering in the desert for 40 years. God is patient and gave the Israelites an opportunity to accept him before he destroyed Jerusalem. And that is the proper, in my view, understanding of that verse. Again, if you're going to take the Bible in a wooden, literal sense, then Jesus is in fact a lamb with wool who goes ba, 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 or he is a lion because he's called the Lion of Judah, so now he's a big cat. And it's really not understanding the language that produces the majority of these memes. So that is the episode today, and I guess we're ended right at 90 minutes. So thank you for visiting. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you're on the podcast, this is where I'll do the quick commercial. I know these are long sometimes, and sitting in front of the computer and looking at my smiling face or my confused face as I'm trying to read my notes may not always be the best experience. You can get the podcast wherever you get audio. So whether that's, the native app installed on your Apple phone or your Google phone, or use Spotify or any of the myriad of others, all of those are places where you can find the Footlight podcast. The podcast is also on Facebook, if that's easier than just grabbing a podcast app. It's there, and the podcast for this will be uploaded shortly if you want to share it. So thanks again. I hope you found this valuable. It's one of those things where it's a little bit of a labor of love, and I hope that it is adding to your life. I know that you are going to be disagreeing, some of you. Please feel free to disagree in the comments or to disagree in a private message. I have no problem defending my views against all comers. I do have a problem with it if you insist on being disrespectful to me or any of the other commenters. Those kinds of things will be, in fact, taken down, and people who insist on being combative or disrespectful will be banned from the page. We're trying to put a place together for respectful dialogue. Thanks again. This is the Footlight Broadcast. I'll be back next Sunday with another episode.